John Medina, one of my all-time favorite scientists. Good to see you.
What a lovely way to start an interview. Thank you very much, Carmine.
John, you once said that you are a nice guy and a grumpy scientist. Which one showed up today?
Well, hopefully both in equal measure. I am a grumpy scientist, but hopefully I'm a nice guy. You only get on my grumpy side when people start to describe things that do not have a strong basis in the empirical world, do not have an evidence-based support to it, and are given more as an opinion. Then I get positively grumpy.
I'd like to explain something for everyone in language they can understand. John Medina is the teacher you wish you'd had. If I had someone like you in college, I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more, John.
Well, I've had a blast being for these, Carmine, I think it's now 4 decades of being what is essentially a tour guide into one's own brain and being able to see other people light up and look at that brain and begin to figure out how theirs works and then start to think about doing experiments that can kind of push the ball down the field eventually. It's probably the highlight of my life. So I appreciate that and I enjoy it. I haven't had a boring day in 40 years.
You once said the brain is an amazing thing, but very few of us know much about it.
Yeah.
What do we know about the brain?
Well, there's a lot we don't know. And there's a lot of mythologies that begin to backfill simply because there is this gap of knowledge. For example, you may have heard that you only use 10% of your brain. That's nonsense.
That's a myth? Don't tell me that's a myth.
I think I know where it comes from, because only 10% of the cells in your brain are actually involved in rote thinking processes in the way that you and I would think about thinking. 90% is scaffolding, and it's a lively scaffolding, but it's scaffolding. There's so much we don't know about the brain that we backfill with the mythologies to our detriment, because the very few things we do know about the brain are powerful. We don't know very much about how the brain works, but we know the conditions, the performance envelope under which the brain processes information most efficiently. Here it is. These are the conditions under which the brain processes information the best. The human brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an outdoor setting, in unstable meteorological conditions, and to do so in near constant motion. That's what it's good at. Those are the evolutionary conditions under which this brain was forged.
Would you agree then that when it comes to communication and persuasion, that having even a little understanding of how the brain works gives us an advantage?
The adage that I have in the book, and one that we have talked about over these last years, is this: the brain doesn't pay attention to boring things. If it thinks it's bored with something, it'll go to something else. It has a lot of stuff to do. So where that touches on the brain sciences is this. There is a concept called an emotionally competent stimulus, an ECS. These are stimuli that can evoke an emotion, and we pay attention to that like a son of a gun. Emotions appear to have many functions, but one of the biggest, depending on how you define it, is that it acts like Post-it notes. Emotions are actually Post-it notes that you will tag to certain stimuli for further processing later. Emotionally competent stimuli are immediate Post-it notes that say, brain, you need to pay attention to this. You may not be able to get the details, but man, you need to lock down on that for a second. On the basis of that, there are lots of things you can say about how to make things less boring by simply understanding the power and the role emotionally competent stimuli play in a lecture or in a boardroom or simply in a conversation between two people. The brain absolutely loves narrative information for reasons we're not sure we fully understand. We know that it is an extraordinarily efficient way of delivering information. You have an area in the brain, it's on the left side, left lateralized, called the interpreter. Michael Gonzaga's work you may be familiar with. He's done a lot in the area. There's an interpreter that just lights up when it thinks it sees the narratives, and then just marshals all kinds of other things into the brain and say, yeah, feed me Seymour, feed me Seymour. So whether TikTok and MTV in the 1980s or YouTube now is going to change, telescope those attention spans, the fundamentals are absolutely the same, and they don't vary. They haven't varied in 350,000 years.
350,000 years. Let's go back then. So you're saying that the newer platforms are still based on the fundamentals of how our brain evolved 350,000 years ago?
The human brains as a construction project, if we trace our, I'm going to use the word immediate. There's nothing immediate about this. I'm talking about a 2 million year construction project, okay? And so those are our proto-humans. They start to evolve and change, and the human timeline is not linear. It's more like a bush. But in the midst of that bush, about 350,000 years ago, you got a recognizable human. Homo sapiens sapiens now come onto the scene with a brain that appears to be essentially intact. You get behavioral evidence that that intact is occurring. Oh man, within about 40 or 50,000 years. But you have a 300,000 year construction project, and none of those fundamentals have changed. There has not been enough time, Carmine, for TikTok to go in there and rewire your brain. Your brain will still react to it as if it were still in the Pleistocene era and not in the 21st century.